There is a piece of unglazed clay pottery, roughly the size of a kettle, that can drop the air around it by 10 degrees or more without a single watt of electricity. And people in the driest parts of this world were doing it 1,000 years before anyone had heard of a compressor. Picture a plain earthenware jar sitting in a shaded corner of a stone room, sweating gently through its own walls, and the air around it turning cool as if a window had been opened onto a spring morning. Somewhere along the way, keeping a house cool stopped being something a family did for themselves and became something they paid a company for every single month, with a unit fitted to a wall and a bill that arrives whether the summer is mild or brutal. The businesses that sell air conditioning units, refrigerant, gas, and rolls of synthetic insulation have never had much reason to remind anyone that thick walls, shaded clay, and a little moving air once did the same job for nothing at all. That is not an accusation. It is simply how markets work. A tool became profitable to manufacture and sell. And so teaching people to knead it less quietly stopped being anyone's business. What you are about to hear is not a theory dressed up for a video. These are principles that kept desert households livable through summers that would put a modern heat wave to shame. Tested across generations by people who had no other choice but to get it right. And I wanted to see with my own hands whether any of it still holds up against the fiberglass and foam we now staple into every wall in this country. The first thing to understand is where this knowledge actually comes from, because the history matters more than most people assume. Long before anyone in England was worrying about the price of a boiler, the Pueblo peoples and other communities of the American Southwest, along with desert cultures across the wider world, were building homes to survive summer heat that regularly passed 40 degrees Celsius in open shade. They did not have electricity, they did not have mechanical refrigeration, and in many places they did not have abundant water either. So every method they leaned on had to earn its place through results, never through fashion or convenience. Their houses were built from adobe, which is simply sun-dried mud brick packed thick, sometimes close to 2 feet through, with small deep-set windows and shaded doorways that kept direct sun from ever touching the inner walls. That thickness was not decoration, it was the entire cooling system. And it is worth understanding properly before we come to the clay vessels, because the two ideas work together rather than as separate tricks. Thick mass walls behave like a slow sponge for heat, soaking it up on one side and releasing it, much later, on the other. Through the day, the sun beats against the outside face of that thick wall, and the heat has to travel all the way through the mass before it ever reaches the inside surface of the room. In a wall built from packed earth to feet thick, that journey can take the better part of a day. So by the time the outside heat finally arrives at the inner face, evening has already come, and the desert air outside has turned cool again. Meanwhile, the inside of the house, which absorbed the cool of the previous night, is only now beginning to warm through, and the whole cycle simply resets itself before it ever has the chance to catch up with the outside temperature. This principle is called thermal mass, and it is the same basic idea behind Old English farmhouses with their stone walls 3 feet through, kept naturally cool in high summer and slow to lose their warmth in the depths of winter. Though the desert version pushes the idea to its extreme because the swings in temperature there are so much more severe from noon to midnight. Keep that image of the slow, thick wall in mind, because it is the quiet partner to everything that follows, and the second method only makes full sense once you understand why the first one works at all. Now, to the method this video is really about, the one that people find genuinely surprising once they hear how simple it actually is. An olla, spelled O-L-L-A, and generally said the same way it is spelled, is an unglazed clay pot. Fired at a lower temperature than the pottery most of us keep on a kitchen shelf, so that the walls of the vessel remain slightly porous, full of microscopic pathways rather than sealed smooth and glassy. When that pot is filled with water, the water slowly seeps outward through those tiny pathways to reach the outer surface. And there, at the surface, it evaporates into the surrounding air. Evaporation is not a gentle or passive process, it is a genuine change of state. And turning liquid water into vapor requires a real and measurable amount of energy. Energy that is pulled directly out of the surrounding air in the form of heat. That is the entire mechanism behind every swamp cooler sold across the American Southwest today. Behind the wet cloth once wrapped around a bottle of milk in a Victorian larder to keep it from turning, and behind the damp clay pot standing quietly in a desert room. The only real difference between all three being how the water manages to reach the air. For thousands of years, unglazed were buried in garden beds to water plants slowly and steadily from below. And in dry climates, the very same principle was carried indoors. A filled jar placed in a shaded room, measurably lowering the air temperature around it as its water slowly worked its way outward. Families in the desert Southwest generally kept several such vessels in the coolest part of a home, refilled daily from a well or a cistern, and travelers crossing dry country carried smaller versions slung in shade for exactly the same reason. Because a wet clay pot loses less of its water to waste and keeps its contents cooler for longer than any open container ever could. That, then, is the honest history behind this method. Thick mass walls to slow the arrival of heat, and porous wet clay to pull existing heat straight out of the air through evaporation. Both principles real, both well documented, both used for centuries by people who depended on getting it right because there was no thermostat on the wall to fall back on if they got it wrong. But the second method in particular is where most people watching this genuinely find themselves surprised, because the pottery itself is not incidental to how well any of this works. The firing temperature of the clay matters a great deal, and it is worth explaining why. Because it is the detail that separates a pot that cools a room from a pot that simply holds water without doing very much at all. Ordinary glazed pottery, the sort you would eat from at a table, is fired hot enough that the clay body vitrifies, meaning the particles fuse together into something close to glass, sealed and watertight on its own, even before any glaze is added. An olla is fired at a noticeably lower temperature, often in a simple pit fire rather than a modern kiln, which leaves the clay body full of tiny connected pores rather than sealing it shut. And it is precisely those pores that let water migrate slowly outward to the surface, where it can evaporate. Fire the same clay to hot, even by accident, and you end up with a perfectly good watertight jug that will never cool a room, because the very quality that makes it good at holding water is the same quality that stops it from breathing at all. This is exactly the kind of detail that separates genuine traditional knowledge from a modern imitation of it. Because getting the firing wrong does not just make the method work a little less well, it removes the mechanism entirely. Now, here is where I have to be straight with you, because that has always been the whole point of this channel. The idea I set out to test was whether pit-fired clay vessels, the same porous, low-fired pottery used to make a traditional olla, could be buried directly inside a modern stud wall, packed in among the fiberglass batting that already fills most houses built in the last 70 years. And left there to work as a kind of hidden, evaporative layer sitting quietly behind the plasterboard. On paper, it sounds elegant, old desert wisdom quietly doing the work of a synthetic barrier without anyone needing to lift a finger once it is installed. And I will admit, the idea appealed to me before I had picked up a trowel or fired a single pot. But this next part is where most people trying this method for themselves would go badly wrong. So stay with me here, because it changes how you should think about the whole idea. Evaporative cooling only ever works when the water vapor coming off that clay has somewhere to go. An olla standing in an open room works because the room itself has air moving through it, doors opening and closing, a window cracked, the vapor steadily carried away and replaced with drier air, which is precisely what allows the evaporation to keep happening hour after hour. A stud wall cavity, tightly packed with fiberglass insulation and sealed behind a sheet of plasterboard, is close to the exact opposite of that condition. There is no meaningful airflow inside a finished wall, and that is rather the entire point of the insulation in the first place. It is built specifically to trap air perfectly still so that heat cannot move through it easily in either direction. So, when I tested this properly, firing several small pit vessels myself and setting them, filled with water, inside an open cavity section for measurement, the vapor they released had nowhere to escape to. And within a fairly short time, the fiberglass surrounding them had begun taking on moisture rather than staying dry as intended. That is the earned, honest result I promised you at the start of this video, and it is not the result I was expecting when I began. Wet fiberglass does not insulate anywhere near as well as dry fiberglass, because the tiny trapped air pockets that give the material its insulating value collapse in on themselves once they become damp. So instead of adding a useful cooling effect on top of the existing insulation, the buried clay vessel was quietly working against it the entire time. Measured against standard R-value testing, the cavity fitted with damp fiberglass performed noticeably worse than the same section of wall left untouched, and worse again than a wall with its fiberglass kept fully dry at its designed thickness, left sealed up behind plasterboard for any real length of time. That trapped moisture does not simply disappear on its own, it sits there in the dark, and damp trapped inside a closed wall cavity is exactly the condition that invites mold to take hold and, given months rather than weeks, begins to soften the timber studs holding the wall together. So let me be plain with you, the way I would be plain with a neighbor leaning over a fence rather than trying to sell you a story. Do not cut open your walls and bury wet clay pots inside them, however tidy the idea sounds when you first hear it described. If you take nothing else practical away from this whole video, take that one piece of advice with you. Opening a finished wall on your own also means working near wiring you cannot always see rooted through the timber. So if you ever do have a wall opened up for other reasons, that particular job belongs to someone who already knows exactly where those cables run. Not to a Saturday afternoon with a Stanley knife. That said, the underlying desert principle behind all of this is not a failure. It was simply never designed to live inside a sealed cavity in the first place. And this next point is where the real, genuinely usable version of the knowledge lives. An unglazed porous clay vessel still works exactly as it did 1,000 years ago when it is used the way it was always meant to be used. Standing openly inside the very room you actually want cooled, a wide, shallow, unglazed clay dish, the kind you can still buy cheaply enough from most garden centers, filled with water and set in a shaded spot near a window that catches even a modest cross breeze. It will not replace a modern air conditioning unit on the very worst days of a genuine heat wave. And I would sooner tell you that honestly than promise you something it cannot deliver. But on an ordinary warm afternoon, it noticeably takes the edge off a room, and it costs almost nothing beyond the jug of water needed to refill it each morning. Pair that dish with a little thermal mass thinking, keeping curtains drawn on the sun-facing side of the house through the hottest hours of the day, and opening the house right up once the evening air outside turns cooler than the air trapped indoors. And you are quietly recreating the same two-part system that kept whole desert households livable, only scaled down to fit an ordinary front room. The next point is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why this knowledge faded from ordinary use in the first place, and it is not a sinister explanation, only a very human one. Refrigerant-based cooling arrived through the middle of the 20th century, and quite understandably, people who could afford it welcomed it with open arms. It was reliable in every kind of weather. It needed no refilling, and it worked, regardless of how humid the air happened to be that day. But convenience has a habit of erasing the older method from memory entirely rather than simply sitting alongside it as one option among several. So within 2 or 3 generations, most households in cooler, wetter climates like ours had never so much as heard of an Olia, while households in genuinely hot, dry regions kept the tradition alive, mostly out of necessity rather than choice. Because for many of those families, the electricity bill for constant cooling was simply never within reach. There is a wider point buried in this, and it applies just as much here in England as it does anywhere in the American Southwest. Because our own history of wartime rationing pushed households toward very similar thinking. A wet cloth hung across an open doorway on a hot day. A stone larder floor damped down before nightfall to keep the whole room several degrees cooler through a summer evening. And washing hung to dry indoors on a warm day rather than defaulting to a machine, all of them leaning on the same underlying principle, water pulling heat out of the air as it changes state from liquid to vapor. None of these methods are dramatic, and none of them will ever be sold to you by anyone, because there is genuinely nothing to sell once you understand the principle. And that has always been the second part of the point of a video like this one. There is a related method worth mentioning too, sometimes called a pot-in-pot cooler, where a smaller, unglazed clay vessel is set inside a larger one with damp sand packed into the gap between them. The same evaporative principle again, only used historically to keep food fresh rather than to cool a room. Across very different climates and very different needs, all built from nothing more than clay, sand, and water, where households without any access to refrigeration used it to keep vegetables edible for days rather than hours in punishing heat. And it works on the very same principle as the Olia water drawn slowly through porous clay. Evaporating from the outer pot and pulling heat away from whatever sits in the inner one, I mention it because it shows this is not a single isolated trick discovered once and then forgotten. It is a basic piece of physics that different peoples working entirely alone and with no contact with one another kept rediscovering wherever heat and scarce water forced them to think carefully about what they had. The next thing worth knowing is how this principle scales up beyond a single dish or a single jar. Because the same idea sits behind whole room cooling systems still used across the American Southwest today. A swamp cooler, properly called an evaporative cooler, draws outside air through a wet pad, usually made from a fibrous material rather than clay. Refrigerant-based air conditioning unit. And you will still see them fitted to the roofs of ordinary homes right across Arizona, New Mexico, and much of the wider Southwest. The one honest limitation worth stating plainly is that evaporative cooling of any kind, whether from a shallow clay dish or a full swamp cooler, depends heavily on dry air to begin with, because water finds it far harder to evaporate into air that is already carrying a good deal of moisture. English summer, our air simply does not have the same appetite for taking on more moisture, though on a warm, dry day it will still do noticeably more good than nothing at all. It is worth pausing here to weigh the honest cost of all this against what a modern household actually spends, because the numbers are part of why this knowledge is worth reclaiming rather than simply admiring as a curiosity. A single unglazed clay dish or a proper olla bought from a garden supplier generally costs less than a single month of running a portable air conditioning unit through a hot summer, and beyond that first purchase there is no ongoing cost at all. That does not make it a replacement for modern cooling on the very worst days. I have already been honest with you about that. But as one part of a wider approach, alongside drawn curtains, thick, soft furnishings that behave a little like thermal mass in miniature, and evening ventilation once the outside air turns cooler than the air trapped indoors, it genuinely earns its keep. Even the safe, sensible version of this method deserves a little care, and it is worth mentioning before we finish. Standing water indoors, however small the vessel holding it, needs to be changed regularly, both to keep it fresh for the room and because still water left sitting for too long can attract insects looking for somewhere to lay. So treat a cooling dish much the same way you would treat a bird bath in the garden, emptied and refreshed rather than left untouched for a week at a time. If you ever do decide to fire your own small clay dish at home, rather than buying one ready-made, remember that any open fire used for pit firing needs a clear space, well away from anything that could catch, a way to fully extinguish it before you walk away, and a good deal of patience. Since rushing the cooling of fired clay is usually how a good pot ends up cracked before it ever holds a drop of water. And the final point worth carrying with you is simply this, that the desert version of this knowledge and our own same problem from opposite ends of the world, without either culture ever knowing the other existed. When two entirely unconnected peoples, separated by centuries and by an ocean, arrive independently at the same basic answer through nothing more than trial and the discomfort of getting it wrong. That is not folklore dressed up as wisdom. That is knowledge that earned its place the hard way, through consequence rather than fashion. I think what strikes me most, turning this idea over carefully after testing it properly with my own hands, is how easily an old method can be misapplied by someone eager to modernize it without first understanding why it worked in the way it did. The desert families who relied on these vessels were not solving some abstract puzzle for the sake of it, and every part of the method, the shade, the moving air, the shallow open dish, mattered because they had learned through hard consequence exactly what happened when any single part of it was left out. That is the piece worth carrying forward from all of this, not the shortcut that sounded clever on paper. While shortcuts tend to fall apart the moment they meet a wall cavity they were never designed for in the first place. Before you go, I would genuinely like to know if you try a shallow clay dish by a window this summer, how many degrees you notice the room drop by evening. Tell me the number in the comments, the way you would tell a neighbor over the garden fence, because I read every single one of them.